The moment Dr. Ethan Reeves realized he was going to die alone on an uncharted moon, his first thought was remarkably petty. His ex-girlfriend Sarah had been right about his life choices. The second thought, as his escape pod's failing life support systems wheezed like an asthmatic accordion, was that he really should have paid more attention during the emergency landing simulations, instead of mentally composing his grocery list. The crash had been spectacular, at least. The kind of spectacular that would have earned applause in a disaster holovid, complete with sparks, spinning, and what he was fairly certain had been his own high-pitched screaming harmonizing with the pod's proximity alarms. Now the pod lay crumpled against a formation of crystalline trees that refracted the distant gas giant's light into 1,000 shades of purple and amber. Beautiful, really. Ethan had always appreciated irony, and dying surrounded by beauty while smelling like recycled sweat and burnt electronics seemed appropriately ironic for a xenobiologist who'd spent most of his career studying algae samples. 3 days. That's how long he'd been here, rationing oxygen and trying to coax the communications array back to life with a combination of genuine technical skill and increasingly creative profanity. The moon itself was a study in contradictions, perpetual twilight that never quite committed to darkness, an atmosphere that was almost breathable but not quite, and a silence so profound that Ethan had started talking to himself just to confirm he still existed. "Okay, panel C7, he muttered, his fingers numb from the cold seeping through his damaged pressure suit. "You and I both know you're not actually broken. You're just being difficult because I forgot to run the level 3 diagnostics before we left the Meridian Dawn. I'm sorry about that. Can we move past it?" The panel, unsurprisingly, did not respond. Ethan sighed and reached for his plasma torch, squinting at the fused circuitry. Behind him, the obsidian plane stretched toward a structure he'd noticed on his second day, something angular and ancient rising from the landscape like a broken tooth. He'd been avoiding investigating it, partly because his suit's power cell was nearly depleted, partly because every survival manual ever written screamed never explore creepy alien ruins alone, but mostly because he was afraid of what he might find. Or worse, what might find him. A sound cut through the silence, soft, deliberate like footsteps on glass. Ethan froze, plasma torch still raised, his heart suddenly attempting to escape through his ribcage. He turned slowly, the way people do in horror movies right before they die, mentally cataloging everything he knew about hostile xenofauna. The list was disappointingly short and unhelpful. The figure stood at the edge of the crystalline forest, partially obscured by the refracted light. Humanoid. That was his first coherent observation. His second was that she was watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. His third was that he was absolutely not prepared for first contact, especially not when he looked like he'd been marinated in his own fear sweat for 72 hours. "Right," he said aloud, because apparently his mouth had decided to function independently of his brain. "So, hello, I come in peace. Obviously, I mean I came in pieces, technically given the crash, but the sentiment stands." The figure didn't move. Ethan's hand tightened on the plasma torch, though what he planned to do with a tool designed for welding delicate electronics against a potential threat, he had no idea, probably just set himself on fire. That would be consistent with his luck. "I'm human," he continued, channeling every first contact protocol lecture he'd ever slept through. "From Earth, third planet in the Sol system. We're mostly harmless, though historically that's debatable. I'm a scientist. Xenobiologist, actually, which is wonderfully ironic right now because I'm supposed to study alien life, not terrify it with my presence." He paused. "You're not terrified, are you? You seem very calm." "That's either very good or very bad for me." The figure moved then, stepping forward with a grace that seemed to defy the moon's lighter gravity. As she emerged from the prismatic shadows, Ethan's breath caught. She was humanoid, yes, but the details struck him with the force of revelation. Her ears swept upward and back in elegant points that reminded him of ancient Earth mythology, delicate and somehow regal despite her worn clothing. Her skin held a faint luminescence, barely perceptible in the twilight, and her eyes, those eyes caught the ambient light and held it, reflecting it back with an inner radiance that was beautiful and deeply unsettling in equal measure. She also wore a mask, ornate, ceremonial, covering the lower half of her face with intricate metalwork that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Okay," Ethan said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Mask, that's fine. Very mysterious, I respect that. Some cultures have strong traditions about facial covering. I'm not here to judge. I'm barely here at all if we're being technical." She tilted her head, and Ethan got the distinct impression she was studying him the way he might study a particularly confusing microorganism. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. "Do you understand me?" He tried, knowing his translator implant was useless without his suit's main computer to boost its range. "I'm not sure if you speak standard or any human language, or if you even use verbal communication. Maybe you're telepathic. Are you telepathic? Please don't be reading my mind right now because it's mostly panic and inappropriate jokes." The woman took another step closer. Ethan's scientific training warred with his survival instincts. The scientist in him noted the biomechanics of her movement, the careful way she approached, the obvious intelligence in her posture. The terrified monkey brain screamed about predators and prey dynamics and how he was definitely the prey in this scenario. "Look," he said, setting down the plasma torch in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm stranded. My ship, well, my escape pod, it's damaged. I've been trying to fix the communications array, but I'm running out of oxygen and power and honestly competence. If you're friendly, I could really use some help. If you're not friendly, could you at least make it quick? I'd prefer not to die slowly while making awkward small talk." The woman stopped about 3 meters away, close enough that Ethan could see the subtle patterns woven into her clothing, geometric designs that seemed to shimmer with their own faint energy. Close enough to see that her hands, clasped before her, trembled slightly. She was afraid. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This woman, this being who had every advantage in this situation, who probably knew this moon intimately while he was floundering in ignorance, she was afraid of him. "Hey," Ethan said softly, surprise gentling his voice. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I couldn't hurt you if I wanted to. I'm a xenobiologist who specialized in extremophile algae. My most dangerous skill is boring people at parties with detailed explanations of photosynthetic processes." Ethan woke to the smell of something cooking, which was impossible for approximately 17 reasons, the first being that his emergency rations were flavorless nutrient paste, and the second being that he was fairly certain he'd fallen asleep alone in the pod. He opened his eyes to find himself staring at a ceiling that definitely wasn't stamped aluminum alloy. This ceiling was stone, dark and smooth, with faint veins of something luminescent tracing patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional. Possibly both. "Oh good," he said to the ceiling. "I've been kidnapped, that's new." He sat up slowly, taking inventory. Still wearing his damaged pressure suit, minus the helmet. Still alive, which was a pleasant surprise. Located in what appeared to be a small chamber carved from the same dark stone as the ceiling, with walls that curved organically rather than meeting at right angles. Definitely inside the ruins he'd seen from the crash site. And there, near what might generously be called a doorway, sat the woman with the mask, tending to something that crackled over a heat source that produced no visible flame. "So," Ethan ventured, "I'm guessing you don't speak standard, or you'd have mentioned that moving an unconscious stranger is generally considered polite to explain beforehand." He paused. "Did I pass out? I feel like I passed out. Low oxygen will do that. Very embarrassing. Not my finest moment of human representation." The woman glanced at him, those luminous eyes unreadable, then returned her attention to whatever she was cooking. The smell was actually pleasant, which meant either it was edible or his oxygen-deprived brain was making terrible decisions about what constituted food. Given his recent track record, both seemed equally likely. Ethan looked around for his helmet and spotted it near his feet, along with his emergency pack and, inexplicably, his partially disassembled communications array. Someone had been busy while he was unconscious. Someone had also apparently dragged his entire survival setup into these ruins, which suggested either remarkable strength or anti-grav technology he hadn't noticed. "Right, well, thank you," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "For not leaving me to suffocate. That was kind. I feel like we're off to a decent start for interspecies relations, assuming you don't plan to eat me later. You're not planning to eat me, are you?" He studied her carefully. "You know what your body language suggests, nervous hermit, more than calculating predator. So I'm going to operate on the assumption that I'm a guest rather than dinner." The woman reached for something beside her and held it out toward him. A bowl, carved from the same dark stone as everything else, containing a thick stew that steamed gently. Ethan's stomach, which had been surviving on nutrient paste and denial, immediately staged a coup against his brain's cautious skepticism. "Is that food?" he asked, then immediately felt stupid. "Obviously that's food. You're offering me food. That's incredibly generous and also slightly terrifying because I have no idea what that is or whether my digestive system can process it." He took the bowl anyway because apparently his survival instincts had surrendered to his hunger. "If I die from this, please know it's not your fault." "Well, it's partly your fault, but I'm choosing to eat mysterious alien stew, so really we share culpability." He sniffed the contents. Something vegetable, definitely. Something else that might have been protein. Nothing that smelled immediately toxic, though he acknowledged his Earth-based olfactory system was hardly a reliable guide to xenobiological edibility. The woman watched him with what might have been anticipation, or might have been the alien equivalent of watching a laboratory experiment unfold. Ethan took a small sip. Flavors exploded across his tongue, earthy, slightly sweet, with an undertone that reminded him of mushrooms but wasn't quite right. His taste buds threw a celebration. His stomach sent up a prayer of gratitude. His brain muttered something about proper xenobiological protocols and was promptly ignored. "This is incredible," he said around another mouthful. "I mean, it could be killing me slowly, but if poisoning tastes this good, I'm making peace with it." He looked at her earnestly. "Seriously, thank you. I don't know the last time I had real food. The Meridian Dawn synthesizers were broken for 3 months before the accident. Everything tasted like recycled sadness." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, a subtle shift that Ethan caught only because he'd spent years observing micro-expressions in research subjects. She was pleased, maybe even proud. He'd managed to communicate something positive across the vast gulf of language and culture, which felt like a minor miracle. "I'm Ethan," he said, pointing to himself. "Ethan Reeves, human. Generally incompetent at survival but surprisingly adequate at eating soup." He pointed to her questioningly. "And you are?" She stared at him for a long moment, then raised one elegant hand and touched her mask. The gesture seemed defensive, protective. When she spoke, her voice was so soft he almost missed it, filtered through the mask into something that might have been words in a language his translator couldn't parse, or might have been something else entirely. "I'm going to call that progress," Ethan decided. "You spoke. That's good. That means vocal communication is on the table." He finished the stew, savoring every drop, then set the bowl down carefully. "Look, I know this is weird. I crash on your moon. You have to deal with an unexpected alien who won't stop talking, probably disrupting whatever solitude you've cultivated here. But I need to fix my communications array and signal my ship, assuming they're still looking for me. I promise once I'm rescued, I'll leave and you can go back to your peaceful existence." He hesitated. "Unless you want to not be alone. I'm not assuming anything, but you did save my life and feed me, which suggests either kindness or a very long-term plan I haven't figured out yet. The woman stood in one fluid motion and crossed to where his communications array lay in pieces. She knelt beside it, her fingers hovering over the components without quite touching them, as if she could sense their function through proximity alone. Then she did something that made Ethan's jaw drop. She reached for a small device on her belt, no larger than his thumb, and activated it with a gesture. The device projected a holographic schematic that matched his communications array's design almost perfectly, except this version included modifications he'd never seen before. Integration points for technology that definitely wasn't human, power routing that bypassed the standard limitations of his equipment. "You know how this works," Ethan breathed, moving closer despite himself. "You understand the technology, but this moon isn't on any charts. There's no recorded contact with any species in this sector." He looked at her with new eyes, his mind racing through possibilities. "Who are you? What are you doing here alone?" The woman's hand moved to her mask again, that same protective gesture, but this time she seemed to struggle with something internal. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached up and touched a point near her ear. The mask hissed softly and loosened, though she didn't remove it completely. Instead, she spoke again, and this time his translator caught fragments, not full translation, but enough for his neural implant to start building a linguistic database. "Exile," the word came through clearly, heavy with meaning. "Monster, dangerous, hide." "Wait," Ethan said, his scientific curiosity warring with his compassion. "You're exiled, someone put you here alone." The implications horrified him. "How long have you been here?" She held up fingers, too many fingers. Ethan's translator struggled with the numerical system but eventually provided an estimate that made his chest tighten. Decades. She'd been alone for decades. "That's not exile," he said quietly. "That's cruelty." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the luminous eyes and elegant ears to the loneliness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a dying star. "You're not a monster. I don't know what your people thought you did, but I've met monsters. I've studied organisms that dissolve their prey from the inside out while keeping them alive for days. I've cataloged parasites that rewrite their host's brain chemistry to make them love their own consumption. You made me soup. You fixed my oxygen supply while I was unconscious. You're literally the least monstrous being I've encountered in 3 years of deep space exploration." Kalira had introduced herself on the 4th day, after Ethan had accidentally electrocuted himself trying to integrate her technology with his communications array, and spent 20 minutes swearing in 3 different languages. She'd actually laughed, a sound muffled by her mask but unmistakable in its genuine amusement, and then carefully taken the tools from his hands before he could inflict further damage on himself or the equipment. Now, nearly 2 weeks into his unplanned stay, Ethan had developed something he generously called a routine. Mornings involved working on the array while Kalira watched with what he'd learned to recognize as barely concealed horror at his technical incompetence. Afternoons she disappeared into deeper sections of the ruins, returning with various items, power cells that shouldn't still function after centuries, crystalline data storage that made his scanner weep with joy, once an entire control panel that she carried as easily as he might lift a book. "I'm starting to think you're stronger than you look," Ethan said as she set down what appeared to be a generator core that had to weigh at least 80 kilograms. "Either that or this moon's gravity is even lighter than my scanner suggests, and I've been dramatically overexerting myself for comedic effect." Kalira's eyes crinkled in what he'd learned was her version of a smile. Her translator had been learning standard from his constant chatter, and she could now understand most of what he said, though she rarely responded with more than a few words. She pointed at him, then flexed her arm in an exaggerated gesture. "Are you calling me weak?" Ethan asked in mock offense. "I'll have you know I once carried 17 crates of algae samples up 4 flights of stairs because the lift was broken. Granted, I had to stop and cry twice, but I did it." She made a sound that might have been a laugh and held up her little finger. "Rude," Ethan said, grinning despite himself. "Accurate but rude." He turned back to the communications array, which now looked like it had been designed by a committee of humans, and whatever species had built this place. "Okay, so if I route power through your crystalline matrix instead of the standard capacitors, I should be able to boost the signal enough to reach the Meridian Dawn's search grid. Assuming they're still searching. Assuming they didn't write me off as lost and go home. Assuming my captain didn't immediately rent out my quarters to someone less prone to catastrophic accidents." Kalira moved closer, pointing at a connection he'd made between two components. She shook her head firmly. "No, but the power flow should." He stopped as she disconnected his work and reconnected it differently, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "Oh, that's much better, that's actually brilliant." He watched her work, fascinated. "Where did you learn this? These ruins, they're your people's." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Her hand moved to her mask again, that habitual gesture he'd seen dozens of times. When she spoke, her words came haltingly through the translator, still adjusting to standard syntax. "Old place, before fear." Before, she struggled for the word, separation. "Your people built this as what? A outpost, research station." Ethan's scientific curiosity blazed to life. These ruins must be thousands of years old. The architectural style alone suggests a civilization that understood energy manipulation at a level humans are still theorizing about. The crystalline technology, the organic integration of structure and function. Kalira, your people were incredible. She flinched at the word, barely perceptible, but Ethan caught it. Were, past tense. As if that incredible civilization had somehow become something else, something that exiled its own to lifeless moons. "What happened?" he asked softly. "Why are you here alone?" Kalira's hands stilled on the equipment. For a long moment Ethan thought she wouldn't answer, that he'd pushed too far too fast. Then she stood and walked to the chamber's entrance, looking out at the twilit landscape. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that his translator almost missed it. "I take energy, life." She turned to face him, and even with the mask he could see the shame in her posture. "Touch." And she gestured weakly, searching for words, "empty, hurt, die if too much." Ethan processed this carefully. Some kind of energy absorption ability. Vampiric, in a way, though the mechanism was probably far more sophisticated than Earth mythology suggested. You drain bioenergy from living things through physical contact. She nodded, her whole body tense as if expecting him to recoil, to flee, to confirm every terrible thing she'd been told about herself. "That's fascinating," Ethan said instead, his scientist's brain immediately spinning through questions. "The biological mechanism alone must be incredibly complex. How do you control the transfer rate? Is it voluntary or autonomic? What kind of energy exactly? Cellular electrical potential, chemical bonds, something at the quantum level?" He stood, moving toward her with the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered a new research subject. "Have you ever studied it yourself? Do you understand the process?" Kalira stared at him as if he'd started speaking in tongues. "You not afraid?" "Afraid? Kalira, you're a walking violation of thermodynamics. You're possibly the most interesting xenobiological specimen I've ever encountered, and I once spent 3 months studying a microorganism that could survive inside a star." He caught himself. "Sorry, specimen is a terrible word. You're a person, not a research subject, but you're also absolutely incredible from a scientific standpoint." "Monster," she said, the word heavy with old pain. "They say monster, dangerous, wrong." "They were idiots," Ethan said flatly. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I understand the cultural context that led to your exile. Maybe there were accidents, maybe people got hurt before you learned to control your abilities. But calling you a monster for having a biological capability you were born with, that's like calling a shark a monster for having teeth. It's what you are. It's not evil, it's not wrong, it's just evolution doing its weird, creative thing." I kill, Kalira said, and her voice cracked. Young, before control, I kill. The confession hung in the air between them. Ethan absorbed it, understanding dawning. A child with lethal abilities she didn't understand, couldn't control. The fear that must have surrounded her, the isolation that came not from choice but from everyone else's terror. How old were you? He asked gently. She held up fingers. His translator suggested equivalent to 7 or 8 human years. You were a child, Ethan said. Children don't have control over their abilities, whatever those abilities are. Human children break things constantly. We just usually can't break things as dramatically as you could. He moved closer, stopping just outside what he estimated was her comfort zone. You're not a monster. You're someone who was dealt an incredibly difficult hand, and then blamed for not knowing how to play it perfectly from birth. That's not justice. That's just cruelty dressed up as safety. Kalira's hands trembled. She reached up slowly, and for the first time since he'd met her, she touched the release mechanism on her mask. It disengaged with a soft click and she lowered it, revealing the face she'd hidden for decades. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and felt his breath catch. She was beautiful. Not in spite of her luminous eyes and delicate pointed ears, but because of them, because of the elegant bone structure and the soft vulnerability in her expression and the way she stood there, terrified and brave in equal measure, waiting for his judgment. The most beautiful in the galaxy, Ethan said quietly, meaning every word. Definitely not scary. Maybe a little intimidating because you're about 4 times smarter than me, but that's more of a me problem. A tear traced down Kalira's cheek, catching the ambient light. She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob, and Ethan carefully, telegraphing his movement, reached out to offer a hand in comfort, then remembered her abilities and stopped. Can you control it now? He asked, the energy transfer. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Then it's your choice, he said simply. I trust you. The rescue ship arrived on day 23. Its distinctive iron trail cutting across the gas giant's rings like a knife through silk. Ethan watched it approach from the ruin's highest vantage point, Kalira standing beside him with her mask back in place. She'd worn it constantly since the ship appeared on their makeshift sensors, retreating into old protective habits like armor against expected judgment. They found you, she said quietly, and Ethan couldn't tell if that was relief or sorrow in her voice. They found us, he corrected. Kalira, you don't have to hide, not anymore. She turned those luminous eyes toward him, visible above the mask's edge. You not know my people, not know what they think of me. Then they're about to get educated, Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. His hand moved instinctively to the data pad, where he'd spent the last week documenting everything. Kalira's abilities, the ruins' technology, the historical records they'd uncovered suggesting her gifts weren't aberrations but ancient, honored capabilities that a fearful modern society had forgotten. He'd built a case the way he'd build any scientific argument, with evidence and logic and enough xenobiological theory to bore most people into submission. The ship settled onto the obsidian plain with practiced precision, and Ethan's heart sank when he recognized the configuration. Not just a rescue vessel, a diplomatic transport, which meant the Meridian Dawn had reported his pod's trajectory through Vosker space, and someone had decided this required official channels. Of course it's complicated, he muttered. Why would my rescue be simple? The boarding ramp extended, and 3 figures emerged. 2 humans in standard expedition gear, and 1 Vosker in formal diplomatic robes that seemed designed to communicate maximum authority with minimum warmth. Ethan felt Kalira stiffen beside him. That's Ambassador Thaloras, she whispered. He was there when they sent me away. Perfect, Ethan said. I've always wanted to have a heated diplomatic incident before breakfast. He squeezed her hand briefly, careful of her abilities, grateful that she'd taught herself such precise control. Stay behind me. Let me do the talking. I'm very good at talking. It's possibly my only useful skill. They descended from the ruins to meet the rescue party. The two humans, Lieutenant Park and Dr. Vasquez, looked relieved to see him alive. Ambassador Dolores looked at Kalira the way someone might look at a dangerous chemical spill, with professional detachment masking deep unease. He shared Kalira's elegant ear structure and luminous eyes, though his held none of her warmth. "Dr. Reeves," Lieutenant Park said, "we're very glad to see you alive. When your pod went dark, we feared the worst." "I had excellent help," Ethan said pointedly, gesturing to Kalira. "Kalira saved my life, provided shelter, and has been helping me repair my equipment. Without her, you'd be recovering a corpse." Ambassador Dolores spoke then, his standard perfect but cold. "This one should not be here. These ruins are forbidden, the exile absolute." "Funny thing about exile," Ethan said, his voice pleasant but his eyes hard. "It's typically reserved for criminals. What exactly was Kalira's crime? Being born with abilities your people didn't understand. Having an accident as a child before she learned control." "You do not understand our ways," the ambassador said stiffly. "The risk she poses." "I understand that she's had perfect control for decades," Ethan interrupted. "I understand that these ruins contain historical records showing that her abilities weren't always feared. They were once celebrated. I understand that your civilization built this place as a sanctuary for people with her gifts, to teach them, to honor them. What happened to that culture, Ambassador? When did the Vosker Dominion trade wisdom for fear?" Dolores's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "You accessed the archives." "Kalira accessed the archives," Ethan corrected. "Because apparently exile doesn't come with a user manual, and she's been trying to understand her own existence for 30 years. The archives recognized her biosignature, woke up entire systems that have been dormant for centuries. She didn't just survive here, Ambassador. She awakened something your people forgot existed." As if responding to his words, the ruins behind them began to glow. Soft at first, then building to a radiance that painted the twilight in shades of gold and silver. The ancient crystalline technology that Kalira had been gradually reactivating over weeks of careful work was reaching critical mass, and Ethan had timed his speech perfectly to coincide with what they'd discovered 3 days ago. "What is this?" Dolores demanded, alarm finally cracking his diplomatic composure. "The Lumini Network," Ethan said, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Your people built it millennia ago as a communication and energy-sharing system between allied species. It connected dozens of civilizations in peaceful cooperation. Kalira's abilities aren't a mutation, Ambassador. They're the key. The biological interface that makes the whole system work." The light from the ruins coalesced into streams that shot upward, piercing through the atmosphere toward space. Dr. Vasquez's scanner was beeping frantically, and Lieutenant Park was already on his communicator, reporting to the Meridian Dawn. The signals would reach across the sector, touching old relay stations, waking ancient technologies on a dozen worlds. "You cannot do this," Dolores said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "The Dominion will not." "The Dominion will have to adapt," Ethan said firmly. "Because other species are going to respond to these signals, and when they arrive asking about the Lumini Network, you'll need someone who understands it. Someone who can interface with it." He looked at Kalira, who had removed her mask and stood watching the light show with wonder on her face. "Someone like Kalira, who you tried to bury and forget." Dolores stared at the phenomenon, then at Kalira, and for the first time Ethan saw something other than cold diplomatic calculation in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first stirrings of shame. "I remember you," the ambassador said quietly to Kalira. "You were a child. The council feared what you might become." "I became exactly what you feared," Kalira said, her voice steady. "Powerful, different, but also kind, learned, controlled. All things I did alone, because you gave me no choice." "The other species," Dr. Vasquez said, studying her scanner readouts with scientific excitement that Ethan recognized from his own research fugues. They're already responding. We're detecting acknowledgement signals from at least 6 different systems. Dr. Reeves, if this network is what you claim, this is the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. It's more than archaeological, Ethan said. It's functional, and it needs Kalira to operate it. Not as a prisoner or an exile, but as what she was meant to be, an ambassador, a bridge between species. Lieutenant Park cleared his throat. Sir, the Meridian Dawn is requesting instructions. Several unknown vessels are entering the sector, moving toward our position. Tell them to stand down and extend diplomatic greetings, Ethan said, then glanced at the Lauras. Unless the Dominion wants to explain to half the sector why they've been hoarding ancient peacekeeping technology and exiling the people capable of operating it. The ambassador's expression suggested he was calculating political ramifications at light speed. Finally, he turned to Kalira and did something Ethan hadn't expected. He bowed, deep and formal, a gesture of respect from superior to honored equal. I cannot undo 30 years of injustice, the Lauras said. But perhaps we can build something better from this moment forward, if you are willing. Kalira looked at Ethan and he saw the question in her eyes. He nodded, smiling. She'd earned this choice, this moment, this future. I am willing, she said. But I work with partner. Ethan comes too. I do. Ethan blinked. I mean, of course I do. Someone needs to document this properly. Also, I've gotten used to your cooking, and returning to nutrient paste would be tragic. Kalira's laugh rang out across the plain, clear and joyous and free. Ethan grinned at her, at this woman who'd believed herself a monster and discovered she was a key to connecting galaxies. The rescue ship's sensors were going wild. The ancient network was singing across space, and somewhere his captain was probably having a stress-induced migraine about the paperwork this would generate. But standing there in the twilight with Kalira beside him and stars beginning to answer ancient calls, Ethan thought that maybe, sometimes, the universe had a sense of humor after all. He'd crashed looking for anomalous signals and ended up finding the most significant one in recorded history. Also possibly a girlfriend, though he'd probably need to file some extremely unusual first contact forms about that.